When a teacher's attempt to humiliate a student backfires in an astonishing way, it creates an unforgettable moment. The usual chatter of middle schoolers filled room 207 at Sylview Middle School in Cleveland, Ohio, as students settled in for math class. For most seventh graders, the subject was tedious, and today was no exception, except for one girl seated quietly at the back, tapping her pencil rhythmically against the desk. Alyssa, just 12 years old, had mastered the skill of going unnoticed. Years of being overlooked had made her an expert at fading into the background. She was the kind of student teachers barely acknowledged, always submitting assignments on time, rarely speaking unless called upon, and avoiding attention at all costs. However, there was something special about her, something hidden from view. Her notebooks weren't just filled with class notes. They contained advanced math problems, meticulously solved in the margins. Her little secret. Mrs. Grant, her teacher, was the complete opposite. At 42, she was known for her sharp remarks and unwavering standards. A firm believer in tough love, she had no patience for mediocrity and often called out students she deemed unmotivated. Some feared her, others admired her stern approach. Today, however, her frustration was evident as she surveyed the room, noting the slumped postures and vacant stares. This, she said, raising a worksheet, is basic algebra. And yet, half of you can't solve it. Her voice cut through the air, instantly silencing murmurs. I've been teaching this for weeks and still nothing. She tossed the paper onto her desk with an exasperated sigh. What will it take for you all to care? Alyssa kept her focus on her notebook, pretending to review her work. She wasn't intimidated by Mrs. Grant, but she dreaded attention. Staying invisible had served her well, but today, that was about to change. Pacing at the front, Mrs. Grant's heels clicked against the tile. These questions will appear on every test through college. If you don't grasp them now, you're setting yourself up for failure. Her gaze swept across the room before landing on Alyssa. Miss Daniels, she called, slicing through the silence. Alyssa's head snapped up, her stomach tightening. You've been awfully quiet. Let's see if you've been paying attention. Heat rushed to Alyssa's cheeks as the class turned toward her. She wished to vanish, but escape was impossible. Forcing a nod, she murmured, "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Grant, however, wasn't finished. Walking to the board, she swiftly wrote an equation, complex, filled with variables and exponents that seemed beyond their level. The class murmured in shock. The problem might as well have been in a foreign language. But Mrs. Grant wasn't looking for volunteers. She turned to Alyssa with a smirk. Solve it. At first, Alyssa didn't move. The weight of the room's attention pressed down on her. Every student watched with curiosity and relief, thankful they weren't in her place. Low whispers rippled through the room. No way she can do that. What even is that? Alyssa gripped her pencil, her knuckles widening. But instead of panicking, her mind instinctively began solving the problem. Any time now, Mrs. Grant said, arms crossed, leaning against her desk. Her tone dripped with sarcasm. Or, do you need a calculator? Laughter followed, but Alyssa hardly noticed. Her focus sharpened, thoughts aligning like a puzzle. Slowly, she stood, her chair scraping the floor, not out of confidence, but quiet determination. She stepped forward, her sneakers scuffing against the tile, and took the chalk. It was cold in her grasp, yet she didn't hesitate. The room hushed, the only sound a faint hum from the overhead lights. Alyssa's eyes scanned the equation, her brain processing it at an astonishing speed. The variables clicked into place like gears in motion. She raised the chalk and began writing. At first, the class was puzzled. Her strokes on the board seemed random, disconnected. But as more symbols filled the space, a pattern emerged. Her movements were deliberate, methodical. She wasn't just solving the equation, she was deconstructing it, breaking it into logical steps. Mrs. Grant's smirk wavered. Unfolding her arms, she stepped closer, watching the problem unfold through Alyssa's perspective. The silence grew, amplifying the faint scratch of chalk against the board. By the halfway point, the class was speechless. The whispers had ceased. Eyes flicked between Alyssa and the board in stunned realization. She was calm, focused, and in complete control. Alyssa completed the equation effortlessly, as if she'd done it countless times before, because, in a way, she had. Countless nights were spent scribbling equations in the margins of her notebooks, weekends buried in advanced math books from the library. Everything led to this moment. Mrs. Grant cleared her throat, attempting to regain her composure. Interesting, she murmured, though the unsteadiness in her voice betrayed her shock. Alyssa remained silent, lost in her world, a place where the challenge wasn't intimidating but thrilling. The final steps of the equation were intricate, each more demanding than the last. She paused, not in doubt, but to double-check. Then, with swift strokes, she wrote the final answer, circled it, and stepped back. The board, now filled with numbers and symbols, made perfect sense. Alyssa turned to the class, her hands dusted in chalk, her breath steady. Mrs. Grant stared, tracing the equation with her finger, muttering under her breath. The silence that followed was heavy, not just from her, but the entire class, trying to process what they had witnessed. Alyssa stood still, her heart pounding, but her expression unreadable. As she scanned the room, she caught glimpses of wide eyes and slack jaws. No one was laughing anymore. Mrs. Grant scrutinized the board, searching for an error, but there was none. The silence stretched until finally, she turned to Alyssa. "How?" she began, her voice softer than ever before. She stopped herself, shaking her head slightly, as if trying to comprehend. "How did you know how to do that?" Alyssa shifted uncomfortably. She disliked the attention, but wouldn't downplay what she had done. "I've been studying," she admitted quietly. "Once I broke it down, it made sense." Mrs. Grant regarded her, lingering disbelief in her eyes. "Studying? On your own?" Alyssa nodded. "I like math." Murmurs rippled through the classroom. Students exchanged glances, whispered behind cupped hands. No one had expected this, especially not from Alyssa, the girl who always faded into the background. Even Mrs. Grant, a teacher who prided herself on recognizing talent, realized she had completely overlooked something remarkable. Clearing her throat, she gestured toward the board. "Class, let's take a moment to appreciate this." Alyssa didn't just solve this problem. She did it in a way that shows an understanding far beyond expectations. Her tone was measured, but admiration crept in. This is what true talent looks like. Alyssa's face flushed. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, let alone praised. She longed to retreat to her desk, but something stopped her. For the first time, she felt a flicker of pride, not for proving Mrs. Grant wrong, but for proving herself right. A slow clap began at the back of the room, hesitant at first, then building. Alyssa looked out at her classmates. Her usual shyness wavered, replaced by a tentative smile. She hadn't just solved an equation. She had shifted the energy in the room. Mrs. Grant raised a hand, quieting the applause. "Alyssa," she said, her voice both firm and kind, "why didn't you speak up before? If you can do this, why haven't you shown it?" Alyssa hesitated. How could she explain the fear of standing out, the comfort of being invisible? "I didn't think anyone would care," she finally admitted, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Grant's expression softened. For once, she didn't look like the strict teacher everyone feared. She looked like someone who genuinely wanted to understand. "Well," she said after a pause, "you were wrong about that." As the applause faded and the class returned to normal, Alyssa realized her world had shifted, whether she was ready or not. The rest of the lesson passed in a daze. Whispers followed her. "That was insane," a boy muttered. "She's a genius," another girl whispered. "I didn't even know she talked, let alone did that." Alyssa heard it all, her cheeks burning. She wasn't used to attention, especially admiration. Part of her wanted to shrink back, but another part, small but growing, felt something new. Pride. Meanwhile, Mrs. Grant stole glances at Alyssa, troubled by her own oversight. She had prided herself on spotting potential, yet she had missed this completely. As the bell rang, Mrs. Grant called out, "Alyssa, can you stay a moment?" Murmurs started again as students packed their things, sneaking glances at her. Alyssa hesitated but remained seated, gripping her notebook. Mrs. Grant approached. Her usual authoritative presence softened. She sat on the edge of her desk, arms crossed, studying Alyssa. "I owe you an apology," she began sincerely. Alyssa blinked. "An apology?" Mrs. Grant nodded. "I underestimated you. I assumed you were just coasting. But I was wrong. You're extraordinary, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." The weight of her words settled between them. No teacher had ever spoken to Alyssa like this, not as a student, but as a person. Mrs. Grant continued, her voice steadier. "You have a gift, Alyssa. It's not just about solving equations, it's the way you think. That's rare and you shouldn't hide it." Alyssa looked down, tracing the edge of her notebook. "I didn't think it mattered." Mrs. Grant's tone turned firm. "It matters. A lot. And I want to help you if you'll let me. There are programs, competitions, opportunities that could challenge you. I think you'd be amazing." Alyssa's heart pounded. The idea of stepping out of her comfort zone terrified her, but it also excited her. She looked up at Mrs. Grant, seeing her not as an intimidating teacher, but as someone who believed in her. "I'll think about it," Alyssa said, a small smile forming. Mrs. Grant smiled back. "That's all I ask." As Alyssa left the classroom, gripping her notebook, she knew something had changed. For the first time, she wasn't wondering how to hide. She was wondering who she could become. Walking down the hallway, her mind raced. The whispers faded as she replayed the moment. Chalk in hand, the stunned silence, the applause. It felt surreal. She had spent so long hiding her talents, unsure how the world would react. But now, for the first time, she imagined a future where she didn't have to stay invisible. The rest of the day was a blur. At lunch, classmates approached her. Some shyly asked how she had done it. Others simply congratulated her. Being noticed was strange, but not as scary as she thought. If anything, it felt good. That evening, Alyssa sat at the kitchen table with her parents, hesitant to share what had happened. They worried about her quiet nature, wondering if she was reaching her full potential. But as she recounted the story, the impossible equation, Mrs. Grant's challenge, the class's reaction, the pride in their faces was unmistakable. "You've always been capable of amazing things," her mother said, squeezing her hand. "I'm glad the world is finally seeing it," her father added. "This is just the beginning." That night, Alyssa stared at the blank pages of her notebook. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a place for secrets. It felt like a space for possibility. She picked up her pen, not just writing equations, but ideas, goals, dreams. What if she entered a competition? What if she didn't stop there? The thought scared her, but it also thrilled her. She knew one thing for certain. She didn't want to hide anymore.